breathe. Something we do 23,000 times a day, and we don't even think about it. At least I didn't think about it until I finally was able to overcome my overwhelming anxiety about global climate change, thinking about one breath at a time. Let me explain. With each breath, we take in a half liter of air. And adults do this 16 times a minute. And sometimes we do it a little bit more rapidly when we're exercising or stressed, speaking in front of large crowds. But children, my friend Dr. Paul Lewis is a pediatrician and a Multnomah County health officer, and children, he explained to me, are more like hummingbirds, and they breathe more rapidly and take in more air proportionate to their body. Their breath rate is 44 times a minute, or 63,000 times a day. And the human lung is a fairly simple apparatus. It's designed to take in oxygen and expel carbon dioxide. And we pretty much evolved over 200 to 300 years in a very clean air environment, which meant that we didn't really have to deal with much more than pollen and animal dander, dust. And so we didn't really build up many mechanisms of defense. We have a few nose hairs, we create mucus, and we have a cough reflex. But then about 300 years ago, we started burning coal and other fossil fuels. And our lungs, like our climate, were really ill-equipped to adapt to the rapid increase in air pollution this caused. And so now that half liter of air in the average American city like Portland, Oregon, that half liter of air can contain up to 50 million ultrafine particulates. And these are so tiny, they're so small that we inhale them really deeply, and they break through our lungs, and they go into our bloodstream, where they're carried with the toxic chemicals associated with them to our organs, like our brain and our heart. And the World Health Organization says 9 out of 10 people across the globe breathe polluted air, and this leads up to 7 million deaths, or 12% of the global death toll. Climate scientists actually also have more information about this kind of pollution. These particulates, the soot, is actually what they call black carbon. And they say that it's the second leading cause of global warming. And it's second to carbon dioxide, but unlike carbon dioxide that stays in the atmosphere for centuries, this kind of black carbon particulates actually only stays in our air for days or weeks. And they calculate that actually if we had global reductions in this black carbon, we could gain a half of a degree against our global warming. I want to put a finer point on this, that basically all those scary health statistics, if we focused on this black carbon, we could have less death and gain against the climate. And for me, as an activist and a mother, what I realized was that by focusing on these small particles that are really dangerous to my children, I could finally make some meaningful contribution to the climate change. But this isn't a talk about climate or air. I'm actually here to tell my story about how an overthinker became a doer. How I was able to finally address a big problem like climate change by addressing an everyday thing that I did that I didn't usually think too much about, which brings me to school lunches. As I said, I'm an overthinker. I was practically raised to be one by argumentative academics whose political discourse was as regular as dinner at 6 o'clock every night, and then sent off to the finest liberal arts college. I have the tendency to so overprocess that I couldn't even make my daughter's school lunches every day without considering the wide implications of overpackaged food, toxic chemicals, the methane and carbon emissions associated with food production, not to mention the social stigmas associated with subsidized food in our public school cafeterias. And then at the end of each day, I'd open up my daughter's lunchbox to find untouched food and realized with all my overthinking that I actually was failing in the fundamental responsibilities as their mother to actually feed them. So I got them off to school one day, and in the morning, and I grabbed my computer and I turned to the internet because I'd heard about this farm-to-school lunch program, and I thought that sounded perfect. I could fix this, I could find a system-wide problem to fix my daily dilemma. But that day, I actually came across a study that talked about industrial air pollution in America's schools. And I discovered that the air quality around my daughter's schools was ranked in the bottom 2% in the nation. My kids weren't just not eating their lunch at school, they were breathing really dirty air. So I'll tell you in this minute, I did not think that I was going to become the leader of a grassroots movement to reform air emissions regulations in Oregon. In fact, even as I found myself becoming that, I didn't call myself a leader and I didn't call myself an expert. I called myself an accidental activist. Because this was really an unlikely fit. I didn't have a degree in environmental science or law or even community organizing. In fact, that was probably my strength because this was something I could oversimplify, not overthink. Our kids should breathe clean, not dirty air. But you don't become an activist because you discover a problem. You become an activist because you do something against that problem. So I took a couple deep breaths. And I thought, like Thoreau said, don't have to do everything, I have to do something. And what I figured was my friends and fellow parents and my neighbors, they just need to have this information, the same information I had just discovered. And so I thought, I'm good at sharing information. So I started sending emails out, and I wrote some letters to local paper, and I wrote a petition. And I actually took that and stood on the playground, and I went to outside the co-op in our neighborhood. And in 3 months, we had over 4,000 signatures to our state demanding clean air. Now, I could have chosen really differently in those first moments. I could have been overwhelmed by the complexity of a problem like air pollution, and I certainly could have been angry at the people and agencies and institutions I thought should be dealing with this. But I'll say, a zillion years ago, I worked at Nike, and I had the honor to actually be featured in an ad campaign, a poster. And the ad that I was in, the copy that went with that poster said, there are clubs you can't belong to, neighborhoods you can't live in, schools you can't get into, but the roads are always open. Just do it. And this really resonated with me in this moment because I could have thought about all the reasons why I shouldn't take this on. I certainly wasn't the person to do it. Let's just start with the Clean Air Act. I've come to learn that the Clean Air Act is the single most complex environmental regulations we have. And those regulators that I was so mad at for not doing their job, they weren't not doing their job because they were incompetent or they didn't want to. They were strangled by budget shortfalls at our state that didn't give them the resources to do the job that they should be doing. And then finally, this is 2009. This was deep in the deep recession. These corporate companies, these corporate manufacturers, industrial manufacturers, were receiving good citizen accolades from the governor for providing the family wage jobs that our state desperately needed. But I didn't focus on all the reasons that I shouldn't do this or couldn't do this. I focused on the one reason I had to. Heavy metals in the air could cause irreparable damage to my children just by doing something they do 63,000 times a day. And I couldn't stop them from breathing. So I had to make sure that the air that they breathed was clean. So I didn't wait around for the regulators, and I didn't wait around for elected officials. I called the company, and I met the environmental manager, one day for coffee one morning. And 2 years later, he and I got to stand over a document, a landmark agreement that committed the company to 17 pollution reduction projects that cost the company out of pocket $5 million. And sometime during those 2 years, I realized I had found my thing. Maybe it found me. But I had found that thing that was a small thing that I could work on in my backyard that could fix part of a bigger problem. And it did become that thing that I was able to understand that we could start a nonprofit so that we'd have the capacity to help other communities and have the capacity to deal with the diesel pollution and the black carbon impacting our climate. But I'd be lying if I told you today that I had some sort of secret to success. Because I will say, to me, success isn't about discrete victories in advocacy. Success, honestly, as I define it, is about being able to keep showing up every day and doing the work. So I have learned a few things that have helped me sustain that, and I'd like to share 3 of them with you today. The first is your reason why. It's finding that fire. As I said, I explained a whole bunch of reasons why there's no reason I should have been working in air pollution problems, and yet, in many ways, this was the most obvious thing to do. Because I called myself an accidental activist, but the reality is, it's no accident for a mother to protect the health and well-being of her children. And then air, as a lifelong runner, my husband and I, air was fundamental to one of the things that we love to do. But finally, the real seed of this work for me wasn't planted that day at my computer in the kitchen. It was almost 10 years before, in a totally different setting, in a hospital waiting room, as my husband underwent the surgery to remove the left lobe of his lung with the tumor attached to it. And doctors couldn't explain to us why a young man, healthy, runner, non-smoker, where this came from. But he and I speculated that possibly this was related to the environment he grew up in. Because he grew up in an area in southeast Texas, southwest Louisiana, called Cancer Alley. And as an adolescent, he ran hundreds of miles a week. And we speculated that at some point he inhaled something he probably shouldn't have. So my fire, my passion comes from looking far into the future. I don't want to be thinking that my kids are going to be facing personal health crisis that I could have helped prevent by taking action today. My dad had this habit when he encountered somebody who didn't speak his native language, which is English, that he would talk a lot louder because maybe they'd understand him better. I think a lot of advocates do that too. And I'm not saying there's not a space at times to raise our voices. But honestly, if we're not speaking the same language, it doesn't matter how loud, and we certainly won't be speaking the same language about the solutions. I had to learn that when my daughters, with one gulp of air, could be taking in over 200 differently classified toxic pollutants. Some of them are in a bucket called criteria pollutants, some are hazardous air pollutants. And then there is a whole alphabet soup of the agencies and the laws that govern them. There is the EPA, DEQ, OHA, there's the CAA, there are NESHAPs, there are ACDPs, there's Title V's, NACs, HAPs. It's a Tower of Babel. But you've got to be curious. You've got to be interested enough to do your homework and learn that language. And there's another language that's really important to learn, and it's more of the emotional language. I have sat in countless meetings with the decision makers that I want to make different decisions. And you have to learn their emotional language. You have to learn the language around the individual nuances that motivate one person, also up to the bigger ones, the political currency, the agency that moves big systems. Because in effect, if you don't understand how decision makers make decisions, it's going to be very difficult for you to get them to make the ones you want them to make. And before I conclude, I gotta address this one, criticism, because you're gonna get it. People who are invested in the system that you want to change are not just gonna not agree with your ideas, they're going to try and discredit you. Women in the environmental movement have been dismissed as hysterical housewives as long as there have been women in the environmental movement. Rachel Carson, carcinogenic pesticides, Lois Gibbs, protecting her neighbors at Love Canal from the toxic waste site they were built over, to Mary Peveto, the sky is falling, air pollution in Portland, Oregon. But oftentimes the criticism that's the hardest to stomach actually comes from the people that you believe you should be allied with. And I learned this lesson really early in my work. That $5 million agreement, a good neighbor agreement that I signed with the company in my neighborhood, I was labeled a sellout to industry. And a couple years ago, US Forest Service released a moss study that put Portland, Oregon's industrial air pollution problem into the national news. And as the news story built in our town and my name and face got a little bit more ubiquitous than most people wanted, I was labeled as, or accused of being in this only for the fame and glory. Don't get me wrong. We have got to be able to listen to criticism, and criticism is really valuable. You've got to be able to listen and take the value out of it, but you cannot let it drive you. You can't feed those bears without risking them killing you. Because there are always going to be critics. Because there's always going to be a better way to do something. Again, advocacy to me is about progress, not victories. But the way that I've handled it, and the way that I always come back to it, is to go back to my number one, go back to my reason, to my fire. And if I can go back there, and I can say that the work that I'm doing today is moving forward, moving in the right direction for the right reasons, then I'm not going to let anybody else's perfection be the enemy of my good. Be overwhelmed. Get angry. Or do something. The first two really are just reactions. The last one is the decision. I am concerned about our republic. I'm concerned that we're on the brink. But I really believe that if each of us just found that one small thing, we can bring all the other big things back into alignment. It's like taking on global warming one breath at a time. Thank you.